Hello and welcome. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception of this sinful world as we journey through the book of Acts, and specifically here in Paul's missionary journey, his second missionary journey. And today, we're going to find Paul arriving in a familiar place. It has two books of the New Testament addressed to the believers in this city, and that is Corinth. And Corinth was a very important city in the ancient world, even in the ancient world where perversion, prostitution, and the like were often a part of the worship life, if you will. Even then, in that world, Corinth was known to be a den of iniquity. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about why. But let's jump in and read the first four verses. After this, Paul being in Athens. We'll take a look at a map in a moment. In Athens, and having converts there. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. All right, let's pop up that map. I joke a lot about looking at maps and liking maps, but maps make things more real because these were real people, real places. And you see this map spans much farther to the west. We've got Rome. I'll go too far. Don't want to cut it off your screen. Rome way over here in the top left. And this is where Priscilla and Aquila have come from. We'll talk about why. They've come down to Corinth. Here's Corinth. Paul had been in Athens, and now he comes over to Corinth. Want to zoom in a little bit on Corinth. The red line is when Paul's companions come down to join him, and they meet up with him in Corinth. This island here that I'm moving my cursor around on, this island is Achaia. It was called Achaia because that's what the Romans called it. And that was the province there, meaning a region of government. And Corinth is right here. And as we zoom in, we see that it is on this isthmus. And one of those hard words to say, especially if you looked at how it's spelled, this isthmus. And it's a narrow strip of land between two seas. That made this a popular place. It was a sailor's town. Okay, as many of these cities were, but it very much was a sailor's town. They would come in from being off in the sea and debauch, basically. But also, they would carry goods in wagons across this isthmus and then pick up over here at Cenchrea and sail from there. Why? Because for them, especially in certain times of the year, it was one thing to sail here. Notice how all the routes that they show are always close to land. They stay close to land. They didn't just, because it was shorter, go out in the open Mediterranean Sea. That was dangerous. Big storm came, you had nowhere to go. Okay? Certain times of year, and we'll see that when Paul is journeying there, he is being transported to Rome. There were times of the year that you just didn't sail. You just didn't go out there, period. During those times, ships could come along here, drop goods in Corinth, and have them taken across and then sail on and stay close to land. That's why Corinth was such a rich, prosperous, and well-known city. And that plays into, when you read Paul's letters to the Corinthians, who they were, the different challenges that they had, because basically the church in Corinth, tremendously blessed with gifts and a total hot mess in all kinds of ways. You read through the two epistles, it's obvious. It is likely that Paul wrote 4 epistles to the Corinthians, and we know that because of things he says in the 2 that we do have. We probably have 2 and 4, and we don't have 1 and 3. but we number the ones that we have, 1 and 2. But that's the geography. It is important. The Lord is going to use this place because it is a center of trade, just as he will use Ephesus, and it was a center of trade, to disseminate the gospel, to spread it around. That's why geography matters. You wanted, if you were going to spread the gospel, you wanted to have a church in Corinth. You wanted to have a church in Ephesus. You wanted to have a church in Philippi. These different places were important, not just because there were souls to be saved, that definitely is the case, but also important because of their location and the role that they played in the world of that day. Notice I didn't say the ancient world, in the world of that day. So Paul goes to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. This is, I believe, and I didn't run through and check, and I should have, but I believe this is the only time that it lists Aquila first. Every other time, when they are referred to, it is Priscilla and Aquila. Very interesting, given the time frame that we are looking at, that she is named first. I think Priscilla was quite a theologian. It's not, if you reverse the usual order, it would have always been man and then woman. You reverse that regularly, it says something about the woman. She was an impressive person. It'll be interesting to meet Aquila, Priscilla and Aquila, but especially Priscilla, and see what she's like. But why were they there? Why were they there? We looked at the map and we had that line coming all the way over from Rome, as in the city of Rome, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, this is interesting. Claudius, the emperor, he had commanded them all to leave Rome, and that happened about 49 AD, about 2 years before, somewhere in that range, Paul was there in Corinth. Why did he command them to leave? Well, we've got this thing, and I'll just read it. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, the Jews in Rome had caused a disturbance at the instigation of Prestus. See how that's spelled? Prestus. And this is probably a misunderstood reference to the disturbance in Rome's Jewish community caused by the introduction of Christianity. Prestus, Christus, Christ, Christianity. Okay? For you and me, there is a clear distinction between Jew and Christian. We can take that all kinds of directions, not going to. But there is a clear distinction between Jew and Christian, not to the Romans, not at this point in time. And that's very important to understand, and we're going to revisit that. So I'm going to expound upon it later in our lesson today. But the Romans didn't view Jews and Christians as two distinct groups. Not at this point in history. They didn't. And that's key. It's important. But there was this hubbub going on with the Jews in Rome, that center of all that was good in the empire. And so Claudius kicked them all out. All Jews had to leave Rome. And how long it took Priscilla and Aquila to get here to Corinth, we don't know. But they end up in Corinth, and that is where they met Paul. Paul, who happened to be of the same trade. Remember, Paul was a tent maker. That is how he would support himself. We'll see that referenced here, but also later on, once his companions show up. Paul would work throughout the day. He had to pay his way. And churches would send money to support him, but that wasn't always the case, and sometimes it took a while for that money to get there. Who knows? Road bandits might have stolen some of it along the way, or all of it, and it wouldn't get there. Paul had to support himself, and he was a professional tent maker. And so, by God's design, were Priscilla and Aquila. And so they worked together, set up shop, buy some materials, start making tents. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When did he reason in the synagogue? On the Sabbath. He did it on the Sabbath because that's when there were people there. The rest of the week, he would be working because he worked for himself, he could have people come, and while he was measuring and cutting and sewing and doing the things that you do when you make a tent, he could also talk to them. And so he was able to continue work, not in the same way, not to the same degree, but his trade as a tent maker allowed him to do that. If he were a bookkeeper, an accountant, that wouldn't have worked very well. You can't be counting things and keeping clear, accurate records while you're talking to a group of 5 or 10 people. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, so they have come down now for a map. And it is here on our map, shows them coming down from up here in Macedonia. He had left them in Berea, and now they have come down. They don't go to Athens. They come on around and come to Corinth because that is where he is. And I think the other valuable thing in going and looking at these maps is you understand the undertaking, what was involved in all of this work, the time, the journeys, the peril, because there was real peril. When we travel today, there isn't really peril. Now, I have traveled where there is some peril, some danger, places where if your vehicle breaks down, that you're going to be in a tight spot. It could get really hairy and uncomfortable. Here, there were all kinds of dangers as you traveled. Now, we talked, maybe not in the last video, but the video before, about the Roman Empire making all of this safer, making all of it possible, because you could travel over all this part of the world, and it was all part of the Roman Empire. But still, these were long journeys. It was a lot of work just to get from place to place. We talk about being road weary after a long day, especially if you're traveling with children. Long day in the car and you finally get home and you just feel beat. Hey, at least you were sitting in a comfortable climate-controlled car, right? Different thing altogether with this kind of travel. So when when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. So now, because he's got Silas and Timothy, and who knows, maybe they took over the tent making. He talks about the Christians in Thessalonica supporting him once and again, etc., and the Philippians supporting him. They brought money with them that allowed Paul to do what Paul should be doing. Paul should be teaching. He should be testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. That's his message, and that's what he's about. And when they opposed and reviled him, he's been there for a while now. This pattern, once again, when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." He left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. We'll stop there. I love this. This is just classic God stuff, okay? How he works things out, his divine control over things. So the Jews don't want to have anything to do with Paul. And all they're going to do if he shows up at the synagogue was fight with him. And they couldn't tell him he couldn't come to the synagogue. He was a Jew. But all they were going to do was fight. And fighting never accomplishes anything, right? So Paul went next door to the home of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. What is a worshiper of God? He's not a proselyte. He was just somebody who believed and would go to the synagogue, probably got curious because he lived next door. And so now Paul, not with his tent making, but with his proclamation of the word of salvation, has moved next door. I can't remember. It was one of the fast food chains. McDonald's, as they were expanding, and some of you in the audience are old enough to remember when McDonald's was still an expanding thing. Now they're just everywhere. It's a given. They weren't always, right? When I was young, there wasn't a McDonald's everywhere. They were growing and putting franchises in different places. And McDonald's, because of their resources, spent a fortune figuring out the best places to put a McDonald's. If they put a McDonald's there, it meant they knew they could sell hamburger shakes and fries. It was going to happen. It was going to be a success. One of the other chains, I don't know if it's Burger King or Wendy's or whoever it was, all they did, they didn't have to have corporate spies, although they might have. They just waited for McDonald's to announce they were opening a McDonald's at a certain intersection, and they'd go buy a piece of land close by and put a Wendy's or a Burger King. Let McDonald's do all the work and benefit from the location, the proximity. They saved a lot of money, and they're still around today. It seems to have worked. But here, they move next door. They're right next door. They're competing for the same, not patrons buying hamburgers, but for the same souls. They're right there. Very, very, it's, as I said, it was something worked out by the Lord that they got to plant right next door to the synagogue. There they were teaching. And Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. Now, what's that? We hear that term often. We don't usually stop and think about it. Who is the ruler of the synagogue? It wasn't a Pharisee or a Sadducee, any of those guys that we think of, a Herodian, whatever. The ruler of the synagogue was just a faithful guy who was chosen by the group to take care of the synagogue. And he was a man of the word as well, took care of the copies of the scrolls that they had, spent time reading, and would be a key teacher in the synagogue. And their synagogues did not work the way our churches work. If you were a man 30 years old, you could stand up and teach. And there were ones they wanted to hear teach or share a thought on a particular passage or verse or section of Scripture. Crispus was the ruler of the synagogue. He ran the place. Well, what does he do? He moves next door. He's not being the ruler of the synagogue anymore. Now he's next door at the house of Titius Justus and teaching there. And remember, in the whole missionary scheme, a scheme isn't a bad thing, the methodology by which all of this worked, they had an advantage. They had an advantage. Okay, I was part of a mission, a church that went to Peru, Lima, Peru. My family and I went to Lima, Peru. We went there well after it had been established, a few decades after it had been established. But that mission had to go there, and they realized in order to do mission work effectively, you had to train Peruvian men to be pastors. It had to be a native church so that if something happened and we couldn't go there anymore, remember the time of the Maoist terrorists, Luminoso Sendero in Peru. Some of you may remember that in the 90s. They thought they were going to have to pull all the missionaries. Well, we had native pastors there. That was a big part of the work. It's a big part of the work that I did when I was there, training these native pastors, teaching them the word. That took a long time because when those first missionaries went there in the early 70s, they were starting from scratch. There were no believers. There were some people who had an affiliation with Roman Catholicism, but it was very limited in reality, even though they were Roman Catholic by name. A whole lot of teaching had to go on before you could even identify the people who were likely candidates for becoming pastors. Decades of work. Here, all comes to Corinth. Who does he have? He's got, we'll just stick with Crispus. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. Basically, this guy was functioning in a role very similar to, though not direct copy of, what we think of as a pastor or an elder. The system was in place. It was seated with these synagogues around the Roman Empire and beyond because of the history of the church and how they had been dispersed, the Judaism, how they had been dispersed around the world. So what we're getting a glimpse of here is Luke, who isn't here. Notice he's talking about they, he. Luke isn't here. Paul tells him about it later. Luke just talking about and taking for granted what we have to remind ourselves of. There were these believers there, these groups of believers. There were even guys like Titius Justus who were Gentiles, who were already believers. You could school them up, train them, teach them, keep going back, sending others there, Silas, Timothy, Titus, Luke. What do you think Luke's doing right now? Do you think Luke started practicing medicine somewhere along the way in Berea and got tied up with a case that he couldn't walk away? No. Luke was somewhere probably building up the equivalent of someone like Crispus, teaching him how to be a leader of in the Christian church. Okay? But here we have a glimpse, little window into how this mission program worked. And now we're going to see that this place, it's going to be core to the plan. It's going to be a central location for all of this. But many Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Notice the emphasis isn't so much thus far on the opposition. There was opposition. They just moved next door. But many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Now what does it say? And the Lord, Jesus, said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." And he stayed 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. Now, in your mind, go back and think about the different sections, the different parts of Paul's missionary journeys that we have covered thus far. When do we have anything like this that has happened? I can only think of one. And it isn't this direct. It's pretty direct, but it's not the Lord speaking. What did Paul see when they were near Troas? What did he see? He saw a man of the region of Macedonia saying, "Come over and help us." Direct intervention, come over here. And they understood that was the Lord directing them. Well, now they've got the Lord himself appearing to Paul in a vision. Notice that? And the Lord said to Paul, in a vision. What's a vision? What's a vision? Vision means you can see him. This wasn't just a voice. It was a Jesus appearing to him, saying, "Do not be afraid." Don't be afraid. I got you here. Think of Paul at this point in time. And this is such a useful thing to do, a helpful thing for us as we study the Word of God. What did Paul experience thus far? Get in, get it started, teach as much as you can, and have your bag packed, right? Some of you out there, you are business people who are in a position where you've basically got a ready bag, right? Because something can pop up in your business somewhere else or with the company, and they want you to go. They want you to go. You got to fly to San Antonio tomorrow, or you're just leaving from work. That deal's falling apart. You got to go, right? That's the way Paul was operating thus far. He was ready to go. He had to be ready to go because he could get chased out of town. And it was just the pattern of what he had encountered. So because this is going to be different, the Lord comes and appears to him and says, "Do not be afraid. Go on speaking and do not be silent." And that pointing back to that opposition from the Jews next door. And it is going to rear its head here in a few moments. But I am with you, and no one will attack you or harm you. For I have many people in this city who are my people. That's a pretty clear message. Paul knows, okay, we're setting up shop here. You know, move out of the Airbnb. Let's lease a house for us to operate out of, or the equivalent thereof, because we don't really spend time thinking about where Paul stayed. You know, maybe he did in this setting make more permanent arrangements. He had been staying with Crispus, maybe, or Titius Justus. Now he's going to be there longer, make different arrangements. And he was there, and he stayed 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. That's a new record. That's longer than he's been anywhere else by a fair margin. Now, here's a question. When does this 1 year and 6 months begin? Luke's pretty good at being specific about things. He gives us dates and times and people, their names that give us hooks on a timeline that we can put events into a general category, such as Priscilla and Aquila getting kicked out of Rome by whom? Claudius. We know when Claudius did that. Okay. But this, 1 year and 6 months, is this 1 year and 6 months from now? Like this moment when this vision happened, or is the 1 year and 6 months in total? We don't know. And if you've ever And I'll admit that I have not gotten into this. That there are those whose minds just go to, I'm not putting them down or saying it's wrong, whose minds go to, okay, let's do this timeline. Let's figure this out. Let's put this on a literal timeline. Here, let's see. Have it up? No, I closed my timeline. A timeline where we can nail this down. Okay. But there are things like this, a year and 6 months. Well, when does that year and 6 months begin? Was it from the time he arrived in Corinth or until later? First of all, that kind of mathematical precision doesn't appeal to me. I see the usefulness of it, and I'm glad others do that work. But here's where it lands. You can have a window of a few years here, give or take, with most of these things that you just don't know for sure. And this is part of why. It's a year and 6 months. When did it begin? Was he already there 3 months when the year and 6 months began? Well, you can read it that way, or longer or shorter, because he doesn't tell us how long he'd been there thus far. Had to have been there a while for these different events that are described to have taken place, but we don't know. So for me, you give me the general time frame and I'm good. I don't have to nail down the specifics. I understand those who are fascinated by that and curious about it, and I appreciate the scholars who have put a lot of work into it, but with all of them, they still end up with a range of it's from here to there or there to there. We don't know. Okay, we will move along. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal, and they seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. A lot here. First of all, let's talk Gallio. Gallio is a proconsul. He's on the same par as that guy we saw back on Crete. He is a proconsul, which is the same governmental position and office as Pontius Pilate. This guy was over the whole region of Achaia. That's who Gallio was. Okay, now, he was a connected guy. All these people were. But this guy, Gallio, is connected to someone who some of you have probably heard of, the Roman philosopher Seneca. Seneca, big name. This guy was somebody. He was connected. His brother was Seneca. And here's the thing. We know when he was proconsul of Achaia. That was 51 to 52 AD. 2-year window that this guy was proconsul there. And they would move these guys around. Sometimes they were moving up. He might have gone back to serve in some other capacity. He might have been made a general. Who knows? There was a lot of mobility with these people. But we know when he was the proconsul of Achaia, and that was 51 to 52 AD. And that's the first time we've really talked about time frame for a while. So Paul's here in Corinth the first time on his second missionary journey, and it's 51 to 52 AD. See, and what we don't know is, did Gallio just become proconsul? Was he at the end of being proconsul? We don't know. We don't know. And then you can take when Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome and try to, well, they overlap, but you can't nail it down. Right here, you got a 2-year window that this could fall in, okay? But there is some degree of specificity that 51, 52, that they are here. Important guy. And finally, the Jews have had enough. The guy set up a Whataburger next to the McDonald's, and they've had enough of him, and they're going to accuse him of health code violations and drag him before the Romans. The Jews are going to accuse Paul of teaching an illegal religion and haul him before the Romans. Now, I said they're going to accuse him of teaching an illegal religion. What are you talking about? Judaism, the Jewish faith, was a legal religion in Rome. You had to have permission. You had to have permission. Kind of like today, you have to have permission about what you say and what you don't say. Truth is regulated. There's nothing new under the sun. And the church all kowtows and bows to that. Why? Because they got tax-exempt status. Break the rules, do something you shouldn't, and 501c, whatever it is for churches, hangs over the little congregation or the church body's head like the sword of Damocles. You'll be done in. Judaism was a legal religion, and more so than most. And that was a God thing that he had allowed, in spite of the fact that pretty much everywhere you went in the ancient world, they were not popular. No one liked them. That's not anti-anythingism. It's just reality. They thought they were better. They thought they were God's chosen and that everybody else was heathen scum. Now, was that true? Oh, we could talk about that. But that a religion that approached everybody else, they treated Pontius Pilate with disdain. They wouldn't go into his hearing chamber because they wouldn't be clean for the Sabbath. How do you think that came across to a Roman? But we're not going to dig into it and figure out why. The Romans put up with it. The Jews in Judea had more freedom to govern themselves than any other region in all of the Roman Empire. Why was that? Because they were so fun, warm, and cuddly, and everybody just liked them. They were easy to get along with. No, it was because God wanted it that way. God wanted it that way because he was going to use it for this, for Paul, having those Paul and John and Peter and all the rest, because they're out doing the same thing right now. Don't forget that. Going out in other directions, maybe some of the same directions. All the other apostles are out doing the same thing right now. They're going to synagogues and teaching Jesus. And because these synagogues were there, because they were allowed to exist, even though they were a thorn in everybody's side and nobody liked them, it was a legal religion. If it were an illegal religion, they'd squash you like a bug, because that's what Rome did. But it was a legal religion. So basically, getting into the nuances of Roman law here, Gallio, this important guy, Seneca's brother and a proconsul, says Christianity is part of Judaism. So what are you coming to me about? You want to fight about your rules and regulations? Sound familiar? Kind of like Pontius Pilate? But there they went to, he says he's king. Here, Gallio says, you guys are fighting amongst yourselves. He called Christians Jews. If the lawyers after the fact on Fox News and CNN were analyzing this, in a stunning ruling, Gallio has declared Christianity to be a part of Judaism and ergo, like that, ergo, we're talking Rome, ergo, part of that legal religion. Christianity, for the time being, until another ruling comes down and sets new precedent, has legal religion status, at least here in Achaia. And now the weather. That's what we have going on here. This is huge. And we could skip right over it and miss it. If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, that's where I step in. O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law. What was Paul teaching? I mean, Gallio's pretty smart. Gallio's pretty smart. You know what one of the things smart rulers know? Don't swat every fly. Don't think you have to fix everything. You'll eventually swat the fly that turns out to be a wasp and it stings you. And it'll create more trouble than it's worth. And what is Gallio operated with the same principle that every one of you as parents operates with. What is it? What did Gallio want? Peace. Peace. It was the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. He just wanted peace. He didn't want trouble, because if there was trouble, Caesar, Claudius, would come and take away his place. His number one job was collect taxes, keep the peace. And depending on how things were going, you could switch those two. They were right there at the top. Collect taxes, keep the peace. He wasn't going to jump into this. Why? What was the upside? How was he going to win through this? Not a chance. This is settled law. It's a legal religion you're arguing about. Paul's teaching from the same thing you are. What's that book, Isaiah? The Torah? What is that? Yeah, go take care of it yourselves. It's like Republicans fighting amongst themselves. Neocons and whatever else, the true conservatives. Since it's a matter of questions and words and names of your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge over these things. You're not getting me to go there. I wasn't born yesterday and I'm not wet behind the ears. And he drove them from the tribunal. Notice it doesn't say he dismissed them. He drove them from the tribunal. He was pushing them out the door. His guards were pushing him out the door. Shut up and go. Don't want to hear any more of it. And they were trying to continue on, as is shown by the fact this, and they seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. Now, a couple things here. Who is they? Who is Sosthenes? Well, Sosthenes, interestingly, if you go to 1 Corinthians 1:1, Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and our brother Sosthenes. Now, is that the same Sosthenes? He's named. And to me, it's kind of one of my own things in getting insight into Scripture. There are a whole lot of people who aren't named. If they're named, there's a chance it's important. So there's a good chance that this Sosthenes, who's going to get beaten because he's now the ruler of the synagogue, who had been the ruler of the synagogue, well, let's see. It had been Crispus. Now they needed a new ruler of the synagogue, and it's Sosthenes. So if this is the same Sosthenes, through this, somehow he becomes a believer as a result of this or subsequent to it. Anyway, Sosthenes becomes a believer, and he's with Paul when Paul writes 1 Corinthians. Think of Paul. He was like a traveling band of brothers. It all centered around him, but as he went from place to place, and we see this with the names that have appeared thus far, these guys are with him, and then it shifts, and these guys, maybe he picked up some people there in Thessalonica, in Berea, in Philippi, here in Corinth. And they become, for a time, part of his traveling band of brothers. The only constant is Paul. Luke comes and goes, Timothy comes and goes, Silas comes and goes, Barnabas came and went. Now he's got his own band of traveling companions preaching the gospel. But here, Sosthenes, they drag him in, or right outside the doors, because they'd been pushed out, and they beat him. Who's they? Who's beating Sosthenes? We got to stop and think about this. Was it the Jews beating Sosthenes? It says, and the antecedent to that would seem to be those who were pushed out and not allowed to be there. And here's the one thing about mobs, and I'm fortunate. I haven't had to be around mobs, but I will tell you this. I think about mobs, and I'd shared a little bit of my understanding of things from my time being a missionary in Peru. One time in Peru, I was scheduled to go out and preach at a certain congregation far out, and Peru is a colossal city, 9 million people, and the barrios just spread out, sprawl out, going up these desert mountains around the city. And I was supposed to go out and preach at one of them one Sunday evening, because they often did church in the evening. And some of the Peruvian pastors called me that early that afternoon, and they said, Pastor, don't go today. You shouldn't go today. And I was like, why? And they said, well, we had forgotten that Peru was playing, I don't know who it was, Ecuador or somebody like that. They're in Peru. And if Peru lost, there would likely be a mob that formed, and things could get really, really ugly. And you don't want to be the only gringo out driving around in an easily recognizable car when people are just mad and in a mob. So they really cared about their soccer, but I was like, I wasn't going to disagree with them. I was like, okay, I shouldn't go. I think I'll stay home. I won't do that. And there were other times that we would be out and there would be a political protest, a strike of some sort, and you had to make yourself very scarce and make sure and stay off to the side and not get down into the middle of it, because you'd be recognized as an outsider, and who knows what they might think. They might think you were there in some official governmental capacity and decide to come after you. Not that the Peruvians are some kind of warlike people. They're not. But mobs are unpredictable. Here's Sosthenes. He was probably there as part of the presentation to Gallio saying, hey, These guys got to go. Maybe they thought he didn't make the case well enough, and so they're beating him up. Mobs, completely unpredictable. But there is a good chance that Sosthenes is the Sosthenes that Paul refers to later. But just interesting dynamics here of what we see going on. Okay, we're going to stop there because I don't want to jump into this next section yet, because we're going over into Ephesus, and I don't want to give Ephesus a short change. I do want to encourage you to make use of the resources that we have. This is our website, Decoding the Deception. And if you come here, we've got a number of things that you can look at, different resources. Here's a contact. You can go there and send me an email. Very simple. It comes right to me. But here are our Bible videos, all the different series that we have done. And if you click one, we'll just pick Daniel. You can go here to Daniel, and then when you click on that image, it's going to take you on BitChute to our playlist, so you can just work your way through all the videos from the book of Daniel. So we've got that resource out there. Do hope that you make use of it. I hope that you find it to be useful and a blessing. And it's easy to find, decodingthedeception.com. Oof, there it's on the screen right there, decodingthedeception.com. Do encourage you to give this video a thumbs up. It really does make a difference. Give us a thumbs up. Share this video with others. That is how we get the word out there. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception. God bless and have a great day.